Good afternoon and welcome to our pilot webinar. We expect this to be the first of a series of online discussions of issues and developments in the area of off-grid energy and rural development. My name is Bernie Jones and I'm here today with my colleagues Dr. John Holmes and Dr. Shailaja Fennell. If you are logged into this webinar via our YouTube stream through a Google Plus account, you can submit any questions that you'd like to ask us that way. Alternatively, if you submit your questions by email to the following email address, webinars@e4sv.org, we will endeavour to answer your questions at the end of our talks. So I'd like to start by setting the scene a little bit around smart villages. So here are some of the quotes which are prevalent in development and entrepreneurship circles these days. The middle class is the drivers of development. No country is industrialised without urbanisation. There are asymmetries of information and power in populations, and we need to foster enabling environments for business. So those are all good development statements. At the same time, we combine this with this snapshot of current energy developments in a developing country, in the Democratic Republic of Congo. So here in West Africa, you have developments which will lead to the largest hydroelectric scheme in the world. The Inga dams on the lower Congo River, dams 1 to 3 and the Inga Grand Dam, will eventually have a generating capacity of 50 gigawatts. Also in the same country, there was the world's first large-scale commercial high-voltage DC transmission lines to transmit some of this energy to the mines in the southeast of the DRC. At the same time as you have this tremendous generation capability, in the DRC, 90% of the population have no access to electricity at all. And this, to me, really focuses our mind on the fact that in the world, up to 3 billion people live in energy poverty and more than 1 billion have no access to electricity at all. So here are two quotes which for us go to the heart and encapsulate the drive between the activities that we're engaged in. Energy is a prerequisite for sustainable rural development. And of course the very famous quote from the Secretary General of the United Nations, Ban Ki-moon, energy is the golden thread that connects economic growth, social equity and environmental health. So what we're trying to do is give a vision for rural communities that lets them combine development, good governance, education and health development, resilience to natural and other disasters, and the ability to generate productive enterprise and bring them together into becoming smart villages. So what does that mean? I'm going to take you through a couple of examples of the rural communities that we have already come across in our project to try and paint a picture of what these smart villages could look like. So in northern Tanzania, in the Maasai country, the village of Tarat have grown jatropha and croton with which they are making biodiesel. They have 3 large generators and they have constructed a community mini-grid. So with that energy, with that electricity that they are generating, they run a community radio station. They are able to have refrigeration, which means that they can use the milk from their cattle to feed into a dairy and produce prize-winning cheese. They have set up numerous micro-enterprises that use the energy that is generated. There are workshops making all sorts of things, there are hairdressers, there are mobile phone charging shops. And the schools are able to operate in shifts into the night because they have lighting, so there are educational benefits and healthcare benefits with the refrigeration of vaccines and information being accessible to the rural healthcare workers there. So the impact in that village, the economic activities, the educational outcomes, there's greater community cohesion because of the use to which they're putting their energy. In the Maasai culture, whereas the cattle are the property of the men, the milk is the property of the women. So the fact that they have a dairy producing this cheese has led to greater empowerment of women in those communities. And the evidence that was reported to us was that having all of these activities and having the energy available has stemmed urban migration, and 30% fewer youth are going to the cities from this community and they're remaining there locally. Other examples are not too far away from Tarat, in Nagara, Nairobi, also in northern Tanzania. 200 watt solar home systems which are sold on a long-term repayment and maintenance contract at about $1 a week, are being used actually principally not for homes but for micro-enterprise. Mobile phone charging shops have set up, hairdressers have set up, guest houses have set up with lighting in all of their guest rooms. Village cinemas are using this energy to show entertainment as well as football matches and other other activities that bring the community together. The impact of that, significant profit margins for the entrepreneurs themselves, in cases up to 4,000% profit on their $1 a week investment, and the community establishing itself as a higher tech hub for all the neighbouring communities which don't have that access to energy. But it's not just in Africa that we're seeing some of these examples. In Sarawak, in Malaysia, the Longhouse community of Sri Stamang have an 18 kilowatt micro hydro scheme. That's providing the whole Longhouse community with low cost electricity, 24 hours a day, at reasonably low power levels, but enough to let them engage in some interesting activities. That's let them improve the quality of their life, maximise the effective use of their time, and let them continue their productive working activities beyond daylight hours. In India, where electricity is available through the grid to many villages, but is only available very sporadically, sometimes only 4 hours a week, by having solar water pumps, farmers can use the energy when they want to be able to irrigate their crops based on specific need, rather than having to maximise the energy when it comes through the grid, which leads to overpumping and depletion of the local groundwater. And in Amaguaya in Bolivia, a slightly larger mini hydro scheme to the one that we heard about before has let the community there develop lighting and heating, important when you're at 4,000 meters in the Andes, hot water, refrigeration, education and entertainment uses. And that has improved the cohesion of the community. It's let them engage with the wider national issues. Their connectivity has improved, security through lighting in the mountains, and healthcare and other educational improvements. So all of those suggest to us that there are some interesting solutions to be found and some interesting things to learn about how these sorts of projects can be led, how their ownership can be taken over both in local communities and by policymakers to try and encourage this sort of activity more around the world. We'd like to encourage all of you, as well as our project, to take up this challenge. You can find out more about our project on our website, www.e4sv.org. And I would now like to hand over to my colleagues to make their presentations. Before that, I'll just say, if you are following us online, you can email the questions to webinars@e4sv.org.
Okay, thank you. Well, I'm going to follow on from Bernie's presentation by giving a little bit more detail about the Smart Villages initiative. But let me start off with a few numbers. So here we are in 2015. There are still more than 1 billion people in the world without access to electricity. 3 billion people still cooking on dirty and inefficient, harmful stoves. And as a result, 4 million people are dying each year due to inhaling smoke and fumes. So we, the Smart Villages project team, believe that's an unacceptable situation. It's something we need to work hard to overcome. And thankfully, so do the senior politicians in the world at the UN level. And we have the United Nations Sustainable Energy for All initiative, which has set out to achieve universal energy access by 2030. So one of the key things that we will be feeding into as part of the Smart Villages project is that global initiative to achieve universal energy access. When the International Energy Agency looked at the new connections that will need to be made over the next 15 years, they concluded that for rural communities, most of those connections, some 70%, will be best done at a local level. So either systems based around the household or systems based around local mini-grids. So the Smart Villages project is focusing on those local solutions, the 70%. I'm very much coming at energy not just as an issue on its own, but as a catalyst for development. So taking an integrated approach where we look not just at energy access, but how that can then enable things like education, democratic engagement, health and welfare, and the setting up of local businesses. Let me say a little bit more about smart villages. Bernie's already introduced the term. We hear a lot about smart cities, but 47% of the world's population, 70% of the world's poor actually live in the countryside. So we believe in the Smart Villages initiative that we need a rural analogue to smart cities, which is where Smart Villages was invented. Smart villages will be different depending where you are in the world, but they'll have some common features. And those features are enabled by energy access, but typically also with the information and communication technologies that are enabled by that access. So if you have those two things, you can have much better education at the local level because you have access to the internet, you have access to the world's knowledge base, possibilities for distance learning. And similarly with healthcare, you can have access to experts based in towns and cities remote from the village, but by sharing the information you can get a much better level of healthcare in your local community. Energy plus ICT, information and communication technologies, can mean that you can participate better in governance processes, in the democratic process, be more engaged. A key thing is the fact that it will enable the setting up of local businesses, so you can bring new income into the village, and that will be helpful to going up that positive spiral of development. And so lastly, with all those things, with energy access, a smart village will be a more resilient community, better able to deal with shocks that will inevitably come. And we believe that the new technological developments are shifting the balance of opportunities between cities and villages, so there will be more opportunities, a more balanced choice between staying in a village or migrating to a city. And that's something that we'll be exploring as part of the project. So, to come back to the initiative itself, our focus is on these local solutions, the mini and microgrids, the home-based approaches. And what we're looking to do is by bringing groups of people together, the people who are actually working on this on the front line, and asking them questions: what are the barriers? How can we overcome those barriers to village-level energy access? And what messages do we need to take back to the policymakers, to the development agencies, to the donors, so that their initiatives can be that much more effective at taking forward village-level energy for development? So our role is to act as that interface between the people working on the front line and the people typically remote from the rural areas who need to have better, more effective initiatives at the local level. The project team is based mainly at the universities of Cambridge and Oxford in the UK, but we have some key partners, particularly the national science academies and their networks that mean that we have access to the world's best scientists. Those academies are people that get listened to by governments and development agencies, but also partners, Practical Action and the Energy and Resources Institute in India. Two organisations with a tremendous amount of local experience on that front line of delivering village-level energy solutions. And then our funding comes from two charities, the Cambridge Malaysian Education and Development Trust and the Templeton World Charity Foundation. We've been working on this now for some 3 years, a programme of preparatory work with a scoping study, a lot of meetings to meet the people who ultimately will be the recipients of our advice. Always a very positive response to the idea of the Smart Villages initiative. And a forward look workshop that we held about a year ago in Cambridge, looking at what's happening now in the laboratory that could have a real impact in 5 or 10 or 15 years' time in the field. And we'll be doing more of those forward look workshops over the next 3 years. At the core of the project is a series of in-country workshops and programmes of engagement in 6 regions of the world. So East and West Africa, in South Asia and Southeast Asia, in South America and Central America. Typically those 12-month engagement programs will start off with a 3-day workshop, bringing together the key people, those people working on the front line, asking them these questions of what are the barriers and how can we overcome those barriers. And then we run into a series of other activities and events. We'll have briefing meetings and reports, capacity building events, further workshops. We're running some entrepreneurial competitions, and then at the end of the 12-month period, a final event with key stakeholders to pull it all together in the region and to think about what are the next steps. And then beyond that, so looking, these are cross-cutting activities that will run across the 6 regions, preparing a booklet of essays, a pocket guide on issues around village energy and smart villages, a website that we'd encourage you to go and look at, www.e4sv.org, and then 2 final workshops. So this is a 3-year programme from here, started last October. 2 final workshops, one in Brussels to input into the European policy community, and one in Addis Ababa for the global community, the UN, the World Bank, and so on. So just to draw that together, final slide. The key aim of this is to identify the framework conditions that will foster entrepreneurial activities at that local level. The thought is that this is going to be made to happen by the engagement of local entrepreneurs who will really push this along. But governments and development agencies need to put in place the framework conditions that will enable those people to really push things along, and to find the way in which we can maximise the leverage that we get from public sector funding. An underlying premise of what we're doing is that to maximise social benefit and development impact, we need to integrate energy access with other development initiatives, and we need to take a community level approach. And an important concern is that we catalyse progression through the various levels of energy access and development. Too many initiatives have got stuck at that level of providing a couple of LED light bulbs and a phone charger. That's not good enough. We need to make sure that these village communities can get to much higher levels of energy access, to much higher levels of development as a result of having that access to energy. So thank you. That's my input, and at this point I'm going to hand over to Shalaja to say a little bit more.
Thank you.
Don't forget also, if you are following us online, you can email us your questions to webinars@e4sv.org, or if you're signed in through a Google Plus account, you can submit the questions that way.
So what I'm going to do is to give us a take on why we need to look at smart villages. As both Bernie and John have explained, it looks like the world is urban and increasingly urban, and in fact the objective of development is urbanisation. And while that is indeed the case, and in 1950 this was how the world's 80-odd% that was outside of Western Europe and North America saw its future, that opportunity has not come to sit home very comfortably. Most countries in the developing world are still a majority nations where employment, at least 50% of that employment, comes from the rural sector. Now this may not be the chosen sector, but it is the default position for half of the world by employment, and as we've already understood, 70% by poverty. So I'm going to just take a swipe at that and explain why we're being unfashionable in talking about villages. This is a slide from 2006. The decade of the 2000s is particularly exciting if you're a development economist, or particularly depressing depending on which side you're on, because it was the decade that was supposed to provide poverty reduction, get rid of food insecurity, make for better health and education. And the demographics were shifting rapidly in this decade. So this slide shows that in 2006 they were already predicting that by 2010 we would go urban. But we actually went urban in 2007. So in 2007, 50% of the world's population moved into urban areas. What's particularly interesting is that the most rapid part of this urbanization actually occurred in Africa. Africa went from 20% to 70% in that period between 1990 and 2007. And if we therefore look at this as the future of the world, well then we really are barking up the wrong tree, are we? I don't think so, because most of the people who went to urban areas in Africa or in Southeast Asia or in South Asia went to the already teeming slums that exist. So here, just to recycle the story, Arthur Lewis said in 1950 people would choose to go to cities because they would be employed. They would get away from being poor farmers and they would become wealthy, relatively wealthy, as a proletariat, as a working class. Unfortunately, more than 50%, between 50 and 56% of urban populations live in these slums. And so we continue to move people to urban areas without changing our development strategies. I'm not sure urbanisation is a solution. It might actually be an incredibly difficult problem to solve. And so the question we're asking ourselves on our Smart Villages project is, do people actually want to go to cities, or are they being pushed to cities? And if the latter is the case, that people are being pushed to cities, then this may not be a bad alternative scenario. There's a picture from West Africa of smallholder women, and the majority of agriculture smallholder women, something between 40 and 60% of women are smallholders in the rural sector. And this is a feature that, whether they're women or men, is actually quite important across the world, because smallholders have less than 2 hectares of land. And if every smallholder decided to go to the city, they won't be able to put enough food in that country, and these would be additional people who work in slums. So this is a lose-lose, contrary to the win-win strategy that we like to talk about. Why are these smallholders important in our story? Well, because smallholders tend to be often far away from roads. They don't have access to markets. And these communities where you have smallholder, as I said, particularly in this picture in West Africa, women don't have a large number of social networks. So the question that I ask myself on this project is, how do we bring innovation to these rural communities? It's not for us to say who should decide to leave the village, but it's certainly for us to work with these communities who choose to stay, for the moment at least, in these communities to have better lives. So I'd just like to reiterate, smallholders, because they have less than 2 hectares, usually produce just enough food for themselves. At the moment, the options we have for smallholders are with large multinational companies through global value chains. They may produce lettuce for maybe Tesco rather than producing for themselves. But these livelihoods are dependent on these global value chains. And they have no other alternative. Employment is the only source. What are we doing in smart villages that's different? Well, we're asking, could they run their lives differently? And to answer that question, could they run their lives differently, let me just show you a slide of the world's poor in terms of hunger. Many of the countries in Africa that are engaging with global value chains, particularly the areas in red, are places where hunger has actually increased in the decade of the Millennium Development Goals. And as we come to the close of the Millennium Development Goals, this route of migration from rural to urban, or remaining in rural to provide food to the urban, really seems to have run out of steam. And so by looking at off-grid electricity generation as a completely novel, and you might think completely bonkers idea, well, it's not, because it's coming into the story from a position where you have no traditional stakeholders. If I said land reform, you'd say, oh, the big landlords don't want it. If I say sanitation, well, where are you going to start? If you start with energy, everybody wants energy. So bizarrely, you've created a level playing field, and you could bring about alliances in very difficult, and sometimes, particularly if I move from Africa to Asia, very demarcated differences of ethnicity and caste, to try and build a platform where rural communities might be able to think about change. And also, when I say rural, we are wrong when we say rural needs food production. A large number of marginal farmers, those with less than even 1 hectare, get a majority of their income from livelihood, as this slide shows. This is a young woman who's tending cows in East Africa. And what's interesting about livelihood options is that, again, with the idea of electricity and energy, you can think about refrigeration, as was spoken about by Bernie, the idea of cheese production. We have here the possibilities of using electricity generation through rural communities for thinking about increasing entrepreneurship, for example, for this young woman's life. And so, based on that, some background work that we've done in thinking about communities, and I'm going to take us now from the plains of East Africa to India and to the state of Tamil Nadu, where we've already conducted a pilot study. This pilot study is interesting. Tamil Nadu has relatively decent, above average electricity connection, but not above average reality of electricity. So you get electricity maybe half the hours of a day. But you have an area where in Tamil Nadu, half of the farmers here are rich, as in they are non-poor. They earn maybe $15 to $20 a day, which is, many times over the $1 to $2 a day that we see as a global poverty standard. And they send their children to university. And that's what they want to do. Now, it's this generation who we would think all want to move to the city. As John mentioned in his presentation, we come up with this idea, does everybody want to leave the village and go to the city? Well, what you find is that the older generation who sent their children to colleges, engineering colleges usually, would like their children to return to the rural area, but not be farmers. They want them to live alongside them, but to do something different. And if I was thinking in 101 development economics, agriculture section, I'd say, the difference between intensification of agriculture and diversification. So what we're trying to think is, can electricity provide these young people new livelihoods in a rural area? And so this is just a slide of the kinds of ideas we had. We're using the leading institution in Tamil Nadu, which is the IIT Madras, which is a premier engineering institution, working with RETC, that's the regional engineering technical colleges at a lower tier, working with those students to provide peer-to-peer understanding of what they want to do. This is just background information. What did they use their mobile phones for? Where do they use electricity in their lives? What are the challenges? What would they like to do if they had more electricity? And so, my last slide, we'd like them to choose. They can sell the pineapples, they can grow the pineapples, they can live in the town. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that, Shailaja. We still have time for some final questions to be submitted, but we will move on to some of the questions that we've had in already. So the first one, what is different or novel about the Smart Villages project? John?
I think perhaps let me offer one thought. It's the fact that we're bringing together this diverse set of people, and the ones with their sleeves rolled up actually trying to make this happen on the front line, and engaging them in a conversation about what's getting in the way and what do we need to do differently to really make this happen. So it's that range of people across 6 regions in the world, which is really quite distinctive about what we're trying to do.
Shailaja, what are your thoughts?
I think what is novel is that we're taking something that was supposed to be a sunset industry, that agriculture is disappearing, and saying there is not just life in this old creature yet, but that it's a renewed way of looking at livelihoods.
That's good. I think for my part, I think one of the things that's particularly different about our project as well is that we're able to engage people at a real grassroots level around the world and bring in those stories and those experiences really from the practitioners in the villages themselves, and bring their knowledge and their issues and the opportunities they've identified and the barriers that they're facing to the attention of the policymakers and the people operating at the top level in multilateral organisations. The next question, what are the key challenges that we're going to face in this project?
Well, one, we're going to be laughed out of the room. We're going to be told that this is anti-developmental, that, you only need, China is a very interesting case. Only 5% of the population can grow all the food. But even China, I don't think, is opening up its hukou, its registration system, to have that 95% move to urban. So you can have an extremely successful agricultural sector and still think about 30% might want to live in non-urban scenarios, might want to think about life, or might want to return to the rural areas. So the idea that rurality is much bigger than agriculture, I think, is very exciting. But also, much more importantly, with China going into signing climate change treaties, the idea of green rural gives them a possibility of actually changing the impetus for how they would like to see their future. And maybe that is something that we can bring to our project for countries which have not, like China, been able to be as successful in terms of growth, but certainly can think about the way they would like to see their rural sector develop before they industrialise.
John?
I think if there's one real challenge, if you were to really boil it down, it's the usual one about money. At the moment, something like $10 billion a year is going into making these new electricity connections, and we need that to be 50 billion. So we've got to increase the rate of investment by a factor of 5. And we've got to make that money available at interest rates that people can afford. So somehow in all of this, we've got to engage the private sector and the private banking sector to get that new money in. Governments, typically in Africa, can't afford to do this by themselves. So we've really got to explore how can we get the private sector involved, how can we get that money to flow in, and how can we maximise the leverage that we get from public sector investment.
Great. I think to those two excellent responses, I would add one which is around upskilling and training. So to give people the skills necessary to develop effective micro enterprises, to provide the equipment to villages, and also to train people up so that they can do things like maintaining the equipment locally as well. So I think there's a number of challenges there that we're hoping to address. So what do we hope to achieve from the project at the end of it?
Is to ensure that the initiatives that are being taken by development agencies, by governments, by donors, are that much more effective at getting energy into the village and making sure that energy then gets used to deliver the development benefits that are needed. So not just education and healthcare, but an absolutely key thing is more productive enterprises, so the rural communities can earn a living to afford to go to the next level of energy access. So it's more effective initiatives because they're better informed about what matters and what needs to change.
Shailaja, where would you like to see it in 3 years' time?
Well, I think what I'd like to achieve is, through the catalyst of smart villages, to get the binary between the city and the village to disappear, and to re-examine it in terms of what are the core problems. So when people say, for example, smart cities, well, smart cities are not smart in themselves if 50%, which is your settled formal sector, has got electricity, and 50-odd% who live in slums don't, or steal the electricity from the formal sector to use it. And so if you think about what smart villages might help us to do, is to ask a more pertinent questions about what they can achieve and where are the obstacles. And maybe we can use those lessons to actually help with some of the informal sector problems in the city. So co-learning, some things that we've learned from large scale for small, like you said, for example, maintenance, but maybe use those small scale solutions to then scale up for the informal sector, which has many more challenges.
So leading on from that to our final question then, why should people want to live in a smart village?
I think people want to live in different locations in society for a number of reasons. We think that today, there's the sort of Lewisian story still that everybody wants to go to the city. Is it for a job? Is it to enjoy good quality of life? But what is good quality of life? Is it also about, if mobility is the future, then would you not like to visit different spaces, or even to think about using different locations for different ideas? So thinking about the idea of choice, which is central in economics, you'd say that is the reason that we want to think about wanting to live in a village. But I think it also is about the possibility of being an innovator. In a very large space, without social networks, it might be more difficult to make a difference. And very often you want to go, it's like small locations give you solutions that you can use to do the messy problems of the big.
John, why should people want to live in a village?
I think if we make smart villages happen, then they'll be able to get many of the benefits of city life while staying in the countryside and enjoying the benefits of the countryside. So you don't have to give one up to get the other. So better education, better healthcare, the chance to earn a decent living, while at the same time having the value of being in the countryside, instead of typically living in perhaps not such good circumstances in a city, perhaps in a slum. So it's a much better choice, and not everybody's going to stay in the countryside, not everybody's going to want to be in the cities. So, more options.
Excellent, thank you very much. So let's look forward to making the smart villages concept more of a reality over the course of the next 3 years. So thank you very much, John. Thank you very much, Shailaja.
Thank you, Bernie, for chairing the session.
Thank you very much, all of our viewers and questioners on the internet. We look forward to sharing more discussions with you via this sort of format in the future. please visit us on our website e4sv.org, sign up for our newsletter, have a look at some of our blogs and other material available, and if you're on that website we will notify you of future webinars and the schedule for those in the future. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Brilliant.
I thought it was painted.
Yeah, that was great.